Chickens? Adama said, more loudly than he needed to. It was at lunchtime, 4 days before the Morningwood Festival. Almost all our preparations were complete, thanks to Anne Margaret's over-the-top, weepy-voiced method acting and Father Sbarro's meddling. Beyond the blood-red sea of negativity and rebellion was a long way away from what I'd conceived it to be, but we were through rehearsing and ready to roll. I'd finished editing the film too, and we'd made arrangements to secure a projector and all the musical instruments and amps and speakers. Chickens? He said again. Yeah, I'd like to get about 20 of them, but 8 or so would do. You know any place we can buy them? Butcher shop, I guess, but how we gonna eat 8 whole chickens? He must have thought I wanted them for a party afterward. You got it all wrong. I want live chickens. What the hell for? Don't tell me you're gonna wring their necks, rip 'em to pieces, and slurp up their blood on stage? I showed him a photograph I'd torn out of art today. It was a Velvet Underground concert in a ballroom in New York. On the ballroom floor were cows and pigs, glass cases full of mice, parrots on perches, a chimpanzee on a leash, and even a pair of tigers in a cage. Pretty cool, eh? Tigers and monkeys and parrots. Yeah, that's cool, but chickens? It'll look like an egg farm. That's where you're mistaken. As usual when I was playing the intellectual, I chose my words carefully. The important thing is the spirit behind it. Lou Reed used birds and animals at this concert to suggest the chaos in the world today. The least we can do is make a gesture in the same direction. Adama was well aware by now of my tendency to lift ideas from other people. He snorted and said, "With chickens? You're going to suggest chaos in the world with chickens?" But if Adama was anything, he was open-minded. He said he'd call a man he knew who had a poultry farm near Slag Heap Mountain. Adama was loyal, not to me, mind you. He was a believer, but it wasn't me he believed in. He believed in something that was part of the very air we breathed in the late 60s, and he was loyal to that something. It wouldn't be easy to explain what that something was. Whatever it was, though, it made us free. It saved us from being bound to a single set of values. We went to the farm that evening. It was smack in the middle of a vast expanse of potato fields. The smell of chicken shit was overwhelming, and from a distance the din of hundreds of hens clucking sounded like static on a radio. "What you gonna do with them?" said the man who ran the place as we walked around inside. He was a small, bald, middle-aged guy who looked exactly as you'd expect a chicken farmer to look. "We're going to use them in a play." "A play? What is it?" "A play about a poultry farmer." "No, it's by Shakespeare, and there's just no way to stage it without chickens." The farmer didn't know who Shakespeare was. In a dark corner at the far end of the shed, about 20 listless chickens sat bunched together, hanging their heads despondently. The man started snatching them up and stuffing them into feed sacks. 2 chickens to a sack. The birds made a brief show of resistance, flapping their wings a few times, then gave up and went limp. "Awfully relaxed chickens," Adama said. "They're sick," the man told us. "Sick?" "Yeah, you can see there ain't much spark in 'em. It's not some sort of disease that people can catch, is it?" I asked. The man laughed. "Don't worry about that. After your play you can wring their necks and eat 'em if you want. Nothin'll happen to you." What I mean by sick is, well, if they were people, I guess they'd be seen as shrink. He explained that there were always a few chickens that would suddenly go into a slump and stop feeding. Adama and I stood waiting at the bus stop as the sun sank toward the horizon, stretching our shadows a long way down the road. The chickens squirmed and rustled every now and again in the 4 sacks we were carrying. "Adama, I know I said I wanted them as cheap as possible, but look at these birds, they're practically dead." Hanging around with neurotic chickens was putting even us in a bit of a funk. being with people, or birds or dogs or pigs, for that matter, who had no spark in them tended to lower a guy's spirits. Just listen to you. You didn't want to spend much cause you promised Matsui you'd take her out to eat steak after the festival. Huh? Who told you that? Sato. Sato, right, that's right. I was going to invite you and Sato to go with us, of course. You were planning to use the ticket money to eat a steak dinner alone with Matsui. No, wait, you don't understand what? Forget the excuses, we'll all eat together. Everybody. Everybody? Hey, steak's expensive, man. We can't afford to go to Gekkan. I already made reservations. Gekkan was a workingman's Chinese diner that was famous for its homemade meat dumplings. My dream burst like a bubble. I'd been counting on having steak and wine alone with the one I loved, and I'd already invited her to the fanciest restaurant in Sasebo. I planned to take her there after the show. When the sky was the lovely twilight color it had been the evening I took her picture, Lady Jane had smiled and bowed her head, which I'd assumed was a sign of consent, but then she'd gone and told Aunt Margaret. I couldn't believe it. Jane, how could you? Listen, Ken. What? I know you've got a lot more brains and talent than most people, but… Thanks, and look, I really did mean to ask you and Sato to come along with us. What about Iwase? Oh, yeah, Iwase, too, he was in on it from the beginning, after all. And Fuku-chan? If it weren't for him we couldn't have got the amps and speakers, you know. Right, right. Then there's Shiro. Shiro sold 90 tickets, man, and look how he helped us get out of that mess with the industrial arts gang, and Masute lent us his camera, and Narashima and Otaki and Nakamura, they sold a lot of tickets, and they promised to help us set up the equipment. I really appreciate it, too, all those things. What do you mean, you appreciate it? If you want to thank them, the right thing to do is to feed them after the festival. Well, isn't that right? I know I might have expected something like this from you, but I'll tell you, when Sato told me about the steak dinner it really made me sad. Man, sure, the festival was your idea, but you couldn't have done it on your own. I realized now how selfish I'd been, and it made me feel so rotten that my eyes filled with tears. Well, not exactly. The only thing in my eyes was a fading vision of a pure white tablecloth, a rosebud in a glass vase, sterling silverware, a sizzling filet mignon, a fragile crystal wine glass, and Lady Jane with a soft blush on her cheeks, and some real vintage wine, nothing like the red ball port I drank on the sly from time to time. I'd once read a passage in a novel that said that a fine, blood-red wine was capable of stripping a woman of her reason. Stripping a woman of her reason. Lady Jane stripped of her reason. What are you grinning about? You're imagining yourself drinking wine with Matsui and giving her a big kiss or something, right? My heart stopped. Adama didn't have much imagination himself, but he was a genius at reading other people's minds. On the contrary, I was merely contemplating the shortcomings of my unworthy character. I said this with my eyebrows raised and my nose in the air, trying to be funny, but Adama didn't laugh. Maybe it was because of having my dream of steak and wine destroyed that I now began to feel sentimental and sorry for myself as I gazed at the darkening sky. I wondered what I was doing there at a bus stop on the outskirts of a dying mining town. I was also a bit worried that I'd used up all of Adama's patience with me. I guess it can't be helped, he muttered, more for his own benefit than mine, apparently. He stared at me. You've got typo blood, right? I nodded. People with typo just don't seem to care much about anybody else. And you're a Pisces, right? Pisces is the most selfish sign. Oh, yeah, and you're the only son too. A guy with that many strikes against him. It can't be helped. He'd missed one more. Pisces, typo, the only son, and Grandma's pet. A guy like you, if you stopped being self-centered, there wouldn't be anything left. Adama looked down at the feed sacks squirming and rustling under his arms. Ken. No, but really, man, I was going to invite you and, never mind that, I was going to say, do you remember how lonely those chickens looked? He was remembering the 20 birds huddled in a corner by themselves, broilers being force-fed in a cramped little shed. You might be a chicken or a human being, but show a little rebelliousness and the next thing you knew you were all on your own. When the festival's over, instead of selling them to a butcher or something, let's set 'em free somewhere out in the mountains, he said finally, still peering at the sacks. On a beautiful, clear Labor Thanksgiving Day, nearly 500 high school students flocked to the Workers' Hall. Otaki, Narashima, Masutabe, and the other members of what was once the Northern High JCA committee stood at the entrance handing out smash the graduation ceremony leaflets and occasionally putting on helmets and making speeches. Yuji Shiro and his group of greasers, their hair stiff with pomade, stood around in sports coats with their babes from Junwa and elsewhere, passing around half-pint bottles of cheap whiskey. The girls had turned up in all kinds of fashions. A lot of them wore their school uniforms, but you also saw painted fingernails and lipstick, tight dresses, pleated skirts, flower print frocks, pink cardigans and jeans. Iwase was selling mimeographed copies of a collection of his poems for 10 yen apiece. He'd never let on to any of us that he was writing poetry. The gang from the Industrial Arts High showed up, to keep an eye on Minageyama, no doubt, but without their swords. Being hard boys, they got flustered and turned red when a girl from Yamate with a cigarette dangling between scarlet fingernails approached them and tried to strike up a conversation. 4 black GIs asked if they could get in, and I let them through. Anything was allowed at festivals, except murder, maybe. The owner of 4B was there, and the waitress from Boulevard arrived with a bunch of flowers for Adama. The girls of the English Drama Club brought about 1 million balloons and filled the hall with them, and the half-black yakuza who'd smoothed out our problem with pimples came dragging a pushcart and 2 partners in crime to sell bits of grilled food to the crowd. Minageyama walked on stage as the Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 boomed out over the PA system, wearing the negligee over a bathing suit. She took an axe to some placards bearing pictures of the Prime Minister, Lyndon Johnson, and the main gates of Tokyo University. Sela Kent started their first set with Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love. Fuku-chan, as usual, sang Donchino, Donchino, again and again, and Margaret was the first to dance, making the great mounds in her blue t-shirt heave and quake. She was trying to loosen up for her part in the play. The black GIs whistled at her. Minageyama started dancing, too, dressed now in her usual skin-tight black satin pants. I turned spotlights on the 2 of them, and Mi's silver lame blouse glittered and sparkled, as if drawn by that brilliance. More and more people joined in, and as the circle of dancers grew, the balloons began to burst. Sela Kent played 3 sets, in between which we staged the play and showed the film. Iwase grinned and blushed when a close-up of his face appeared on the screen. My Yakuza friend came up to say he couldn't make head or tail of the movie, but he didn't walk out. No one left early. In fact, the angel was right beside me throughout it all. Sela Kent played As Tears Go By during their second set, and the angel and I stood face to face, gazing into each other's eyes and swaying to the music. After a feast of meat dumplings, beer, and wild laughter, Amada fixed things so that Lady Jane and I could slip out for a walk by the river. In exchange for the candlelit dinner he deprived us of, he was offering an intimate stroll on an autumn evening. The moon's reflection was shimmering on the water. It was all over so quickly. The angel said, "Do you think I looked okay in the film?" "Yes, I looked funny, didn't I?" No. I wanted to say you looked beautiful, but my throat had gone completely dry on me, and the words wouldn't come out. Beside the path along the river was a little park with a seesaw and swings. We sat side by side on the swings. The creaking sound they made seemed sexier to me than a Jimi Hendrix guitar solo. I always thought you reminded me of somebody, she said. Today I figured out who it was. Who? Chuya Nakahara. My brain was in such a muddle that this didn't ring a bell at first. I couldn't remember any actors with that name, but then I'd never been told I looked like any actors anyway. Then it came to me. Chuya Nakahara was a poet who died young. Jane. My heart felt like it was going to burst, but I went ahead and said what I'd already decided to say. Have you ever been kissed? She laughed. I was so embarrassed I turned red from my ears to my toenails. After a while she stopped and looked into my eyes and shook her head. Is that strange? She said. Does everybody do it? I don't know. It was a dumb reply, but it was the best I could come up with. It's funny. I like love songs by Dylan and Donovan and people like that, but I've never even kissed anybody. We both stopped swinging, and the angel closed her eyes. My heart was pounding, saying go on and go on. I got off my swing and stood in front of her. To say my knees were trembling would be a hopeless understatement. My entire body was shimmying like the moon on the river. It was hard to breathe. I wanted to run away. I crouched down and looked at the angel's lips. They seemed like a wondrous, separate living being, like nothing I'd ever seen before. A beautiful creature breathing pale pink in the dim light of the moon and the street lamps, quivering faintly. I didn't have the courage to touch them. Jane, I whispered, and she opened her eyes. Let's go to the beach this winter. It was all I could do to say that much. The angel smiled and nodded.